Hello.
For our last contribution of the first edition of the International Forum on Digital and Democracy, we are delighted to have with us Richard Barbrook, author of several influential essays on information society and winner of the 2008 Marshall McLuhan Prize for Outstanding Book in the field of Media Ecology. We're really looking forward to hearing your contribution. Richard Barbrook, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm very delighted to be able to speak to you. So what I'm going to do today is talk about a project I've been involved in the last few years. In 2016, Jeremy Corbyn had a second leadership contest for the leader of the Labour Party, and we drew up this digital democracy manifesto. The digital democracy manifesto for his campaign. It had many different aspects of it. We did things like talk about how we wanted to have a massive multi-person online, meeting places, about digital education, about broadband for all. We also actually had a thing in it about having a digital citizen passport, which is some idea of creating like a box, I guess, a virtual box between you and the network, which will protect your privacy. Interestingly, this was the thing that we were monstered by the media for. It took us about a day to work out that really what we were doing was we were actually proposing to sabotage their advertising using cookies. So it had very many different aspects of it. But what I want to do today is just talk about one particular part of it, which is a demand for a People's Charter of Digital Liberties. And I think this is interesting because in a way, our thoughts around this particular clause explores some of the issues which came out of the rest of it. In the 2017 general election, the Labour Party manifesto included a pledge to create broadband communications for all. This actually came originally from a manifesto way back in 1983, but when Tony Blair was Prime Minister and Gordon Brown, they quickly forgot that. So we reinserted that back into Labour Party policy. And in the last election in December 2019, we actually proposed giving free broadband for everybody. This was considered to be absolutely outrageous. It was denounced as broadband communism, which I thought was a wonderful phrase. But of course, now in the year of COVID-19 and the pandemic, it turns out that it was a quite prescient thing to have thought about. But in this, also in the 2000 manifesto, was that we actually got this included as well, which is this demand, this idea of actually giving the users of the internet certain rights. I mean, the previous speaker was pointing out, about network propaganda, precisely this problem about what is our relationship with the internet. And so one of the key clauses was this, which led to the 2000 manifesto. Sorry, wait a minute, where's this here? About how we wanted to launch a public consultation across political sector to drop a digital bill of rights. And I think a key point as it goes on to is about not just individual but also collective rights. So, and I will talk more about this, and I think this is what underpinned the whole Digital Democracy Manifesto, and we're now thinking of planning to rewrite a new version of it, and it's precisely trying to balance these two things and to think about how they develop one from the other. And so by looking, obviously, one of the things that people are most concerned about is mass surveillance, so it talks about that, but it's also talking about how we can try and create a network version of democracy. And it includes here certain things that were in the rest of the manifesto, like universal access, community media, open learning, and cooperative creativity. And I think the ending of it is the important one, about how by enhancing the online rights of every individual, we will facilitate the virtual collectivity of all citizens. And I think this is the centre of it. As you can see, the picture on the other side of this, next to this particular clause from the 2016 Digital Democracy Manifesto, is me in the Houses of Parliament when they were celebrating the anniversary of the 1689 English Bill of Rights. And again, it's interesting to think about this, about how we have this long tradition of bills of rights, but they have very different meanings. In the English example, it comes very much out of our revolutionary century in the 17th century. We had two revolutions: the 1641 English Revolution and the 1688 English Revolution. Sort of along, I guess, with the Dutch Revolt as the the prototypes of the revolutions that have swept the world in the last 300 years. And it came out of a rebellion against this idea of creating an absolutist monarchy. The picture on the top of the screen, obviously, is from Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. And this is one particular way of looking at how do you deal with modernity. The 1641 English Revolution, for those who don't know about it, is basically a debate. It ended up in a very brutal civil war. Nearly 5% of the English population was killed. There's a myth that the English never had violent revolutions. It's just that we had them a long time ago, so we can pretend that we didn't have them. It was about a struggle between basically the Parliament, which wanted a sort of bourgeois oligarchy, and the monarchy, the king, who wanted an absolute monarchy. And really between the Dutch model and the French model. And these are two. It's not between. It's often presented, certainly in the Whig interpretation of history, as this is the monarchy is the past and the Parliament was the future. Well, actually, it wasn't. They're two different versions of modernity. And I think in the internet, we can see this because there is one vision of modernity, which is of a sort of top-down command and control. It's interesting that often in Western literature, it's projected onto the Chinese. So the Chinese state, with things like social credit and visual identification, biometrics, the whole big data collection, it's actually seen as this sort of dystopian model. But of course, we're doing it in the West as well. I mean, the other two pictures beneath, obviously, are one is the National Security Agency. It's interesting. We got during the pandemic, people in the West complaining about tracking and tracing, and you say, well, places like China or South Korea had successfully done this, and they say, oh, we can't copy China; it's a police state. But of course, we're all being tracked and traced, 24/7. The technologies which have been developed over the last 40 years, particularly, both hardware and software, are designed to facilitate 24/7 monitoring. Anyone who's read the revelations of Edward Snowden should be aware of this by now. This is the great on the bottom of the National Security Agency. Famously wanted to have a scheme called Total Information Awareness, which is a sort of suitably 1984 description. And of course, it's not just that. It's not just the security state tracking people who it's real or imagined enemies, but also, of course, the whole model of the modern digital economy is based around what's now become called surveillance capitalism. And that, again, if they want to serve you tailored advertising, they have to know more about you than you know yourself. I mean, there's all these famous examples of people who didn't realize they were pregnant until Google started feeding them advertising about baby products. And so I think what we have to think about is actually this, one of the reasons bills of rights were constructed was precisely against this sort of top-down control, against the Leviathan, in this case, the illustration, or often what's talked about now is the digital panopticon. Coming from Michel Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish, written when he was fellow traveling with the Maoists, the gauche proletarian in France in the early 1970s, where, of course, the Maoists had this basic view that bourgeois democracy, liberal democracy, was a sham, and that the state was inherently fascistic and authoritarian. And the Panopticon, interesting, that model, though it's presented in sort of, obviously postmodernist rhetoric, that's where the inspiration comes from, this particular cultural revolution view of the Western state. But, of course, as I said, it's interesting that it's become popularized not just on the radical left, because sort of French Maoism disappeared decades ago, but is actually right across the political spectrum. You can go on to, I don't know, Zero Hedge or any of these sort of conspiracy type websites, and you'll find, you know, neoliberals, American libertarians using this word panopticon because they see this, the state as the Leviathan, and it's using this digital media to spy on us, both in hardware and in software. And we should always remember that Google was, you know, partly funded by National Security Agency funding right at the beginning. So I think that's something to do. So again, that could be compared to, you know, lots of the people who created it, even if they were getting somewhat dodgy funding from the US military, actually had a much better view of what this technology should do, that it's not simply a military command and control system, but it's also something, as the insert says, you know, it's for everybody. And it's about, you know, when he talks about the responsible use of this new medium, it's how do we do this? How do we actually think about giving people rights to use this medium and also responsibility? And again, I thought it was interesting listening to the previous speaker talking about the network propaganda book, because that's precisely the problem that we're in. Because how do you, you know, if you just take a very simplistic view of freedom, it is freedom to do things like Donald Trump claiming that he's won an election that he's obviously lost, and all the stuff that goes with it, mobilizing people around, you know, against vaccinations, or the QAnon conspiracies about whipping people up in this particular way. So we have to think about rights in a more complicated way. Now, as I said, the counter to the Leviathan in the English Revolution comes out of these people called the Levellers, and in fact they wrote in 1647 the Agreement of the People, which was which was an attempt to think about, once you get rid of the king, the Leviathan, how do you create a democracy? And they had two ideas, which I think have been very influential ever since. The first, which they took from the Italian city-states as much as anything else, particularly reading Machiavelli, Niccolò Machiavelli, The Prince and the Discourses, was the concept of republicanism. So they wanted to have a parliament which would have all males being having a vote, which of course for the 17th century was incredibly radical, and it to be elected regularly, either annually or biannually. The House of Representatives in the American Constitution, actually, which is the only really democratic part of the American Constitution, of course, is actually based upon this idea about having a universal suffrage, or male suffrage, and it having very regular elections. But of course, what they then thought about, what's interesting, is that they actually saw the rights of people as not something that the state creates, but actually pre-existing. And all bills of rights, in a sense, come out of this radical idea they had, that the purpose of the Republic is to actually to nurture these rights. And they had some very basic rights they wanted, like freedom of conscience. They were obviously, in the 17th century, wars were over attempts by the state and by the rulers to impose religious orthodoxy on people. And let us remember, they would torture and even murder people who disagreed with very idiosyncratic interpretations of the Bible. Things like amnesty for, you know, people who'd fought in the Civil War against to overthrow the monarchy. And but the key thing that's interesting at the end of these clauses was this final clause, which is about that they saw rights as a way of creating a legal structure which would then allow people to be able to run their own lives. And so again, this is saying that the laws must be good and not evidently destructive to the safety and well-being of the people. And we can see, you know, we can see this, I mean, particularly in the last 20 years, since the 9/11 attack, the way that the security state has used law to actually roll back our rights and to impose upon us a form of surveillance, which they denounce loudly when the Chinese state does it, but suddenly forget about it when they do it themselves. It's interesting. These diagrams are from actually Putney Church, where they had a debate, the debates which the Levellers had, where they which actually tackle a lot of these issues, which would become a standard part of our democratic discussion, and build, not just the Republican or liberals, but also, I think, particularly because I'm talking about Labour, the socialist movement in England and across Europe, and then eventually the world. So Jeremy Corbyn, who we wrote this Digital Democracy Manifesto, one of his two heroes are Salvador Allende, who I'll touch at the end, but also John Milburn, who was the key thinker behind these the Leveller movement. Okay, so the start of any concept of a digital bill of rights is to reaffirm what we could call the basic, often called liberal rights, or civil and Republican rights. So there's a sort of civil rights, that is the right of us as individuals. Obviously, if you're John Locke or the founding fathers of the American Republic, or many other people who wrote the European Convention on Human Rights, is that it's basically the rights of the bourgeois individual, usually the male property owner. In England in the 17th century, it was the Protestant male property owner. Obviously, in America in the 18th century, it was the white male property owner. And obviously excluding people like men without property, women, children, and of course, in the American case, people who were property. Okay, so but it hasn't. Even if we are aware of these limitations, it has a very radical component compared to everything previously. And I think this, again, the thing is, and it's interesting that almost every one of these bills of rights, we collected large numbers from all over the world, actually all reinstate this really basic thing. I mean, the most famous being, the First Amendment of the American Constitution, that's number one in there, the US Bill of Rights, is the freedom of speech, so that everybody should have the freedom of speech. And again, it's something in a sense we take for granted. And obviously, when something like, as the previous speaker said, the state, we want the state to regulate against, QAnon or other bad actors. Of course, we're all as instinctively wary of this because of this right of freedom of speech was asserted against tyranny. I mean, in the 17th and 18th century, it's obviously the king and the church attempts to control what we think. But and in the 19th and 20th century, and even today, it's against authoritarian states or even totalitarian states, which will invade not just it will not only punish you for what you say in public, but also what you think in private. And of course, the internet, because it is this sort of strange mixture of public and private, it's really important to reassert our right of freedom of speech. So if we think about regulation of what people are saying online, we always have to be aware that this is one of the basic appeals of it, is that when faced, if you think about 20, 30 years ago, when faced with a sort of monopolization of the media by large corporations, public or private, one of the things the internet offered was a place where people could say what they actually thought, as opposed to what the New York Times thought, or I don't know, CNN thought, or the RAI in Italy, or the BBC here in England. Okay, so this J.F. Jarvis thing is a good, so that, freedom is our default. We should actually be able to say. But the flip side of this is actually privacy. And this is interesting that, in a way, what's happened in the last 20, 30 years, we have had a freedom of speech. I mean, it is extraordinary compared to actually what it was like, the ease of which people can actually set up a website, a YouTube channel, download, set up, distribute podcasts and so on. So this is it. But the problem is, of course, is people then feel inhibited if they know that they are being monitored 24/7. And as I said, it was interesting that this is not just a question of the authoritarian state. When we proposed this digital citizen passport, we realized the reason why we were being attacked by the mainstream media was exactly that their advertising model depended on invading people's privacy. So a lot of these bills of rights also are about trying to protect privacy. So the question is, can you balance the two? Because obviously a lot of disinformation on the internet is around anonymity. If you can hide behind a pseudonym, you can troll people, you can spread falsehoods, you can say that Donald Trump won the US presidential election when he obviously didn't. So again, these are things, but these are the basics, is that and I think it's one of the things that I think I like the idea that when they talk about if we live in a surveillance society, what we really want to move towards is a surveillance society. That is, we have privacy, but those in power don't. And in a sense, that our society is balanced the wrong way around. So there's commercial secrecy. The government has official secrets. But our lives are completely transparent. In a way, what we should do is the other way around. That it ought to be those in power, whether it's private or state power, are completely visible, whereas we ourselves have a space of privacy. Because with that, in a way, freedom of speech depends on privacy, because people actually have to have a space to have heretical thoughts before they can go public. And I know teaching students, it's interesting in the last few years how a lot of them have become very circumspect, actually, they said, about what they say online, not just because of paranoia about what the state might be seeing, but actually if they say something out of line with whatever the latest fashion is, that they might get monstered by their social peers. And again, this is an interesting dilemma that we could think about in these bills of rights. So, but in a way, as I said, because a lot of these original ideas, the sort of, certainly the civil rights come out of the liberal period. It's of self-sufficient property owners, people who own their own business, people who own their own farms, or if you're Thomas Jefferson, your own slave plantation. It assumes that it's an oligarchy, though it says, we the people, or the rights for everybody. Actually, the assumption is everybody is only actually a very small minority of society. And I think one of the key things that certainly, obviously, coming out of a Labour Party, a Socialist Party, is that those either push this forward. The idea that first you have civil rights for everybody, then you eventually give political rights to everybody. Again, we can think this is quite a recent achievement. Britain did not have political democracy until 1928. So America did not have democracy until 1965. Eastern Europe, not till 1989. So now, but what we need to do now is think about the underpinning of that. I think certainly from the 19th century onwards, socialists were demanding is, if you want to have the civil and political rights, you've got to create the socio-economic underpinnings of a lot of, obviously, welfare legislation has been based upon this. And it's interesting, again, to see that something like the Italian Parliament Declaration of Internet Rights pushes in this direction. In a way, it's all right saying everybody has freedom of speech online, but if they're can't get online, this is a problem. I mean, during the pandemic in this country, this has been really illustrated. I mean, it's all right saying we're all going over to virtual classrooms, but if people don't have access to broadband because, the telecom system here has been privatized, if you have a firm in the city, you have amazing connections, but if you're out in a rural area or deprived in a city, often the connection is very poor. It's definitely not broadband speed. And again, access to the latest, hardware, because if you want to run a lot of these things, like we're using Microsoft or Zoom or something, you need to have a reasonable camera in your, you need to have often, or you have to have a smartphone. Again, so actually to give people the technology. So there is a real basic hardware issue at the bottom of it. And the second thing, and I think that's also important, is this is this concept of digital literacy. So on the bottom right-hand side of this slide, it's actually one of a project actually done in Brazil. So under the previous government, before they ended up with their version of Donald Trump or Boris Johnson, under the PT, the Workers' Party, they actually went out and tried to create digital literacy in the favelas, out in the rural areas. And so this is a media hotspot where they were setting up these cyber cafes and teaching people actually how to use it. And I think this is, again, an important thing that we actually add in the wider Digital Democracy Manifesto, was actually, you know, some basic things like actually create, you know, a really good example is I work at a university. There's huge amounts of academic articles produced, but they're all about really expensive paywalls. So you actually have the ridiculous thing is the British taxpayer pays academics to write articles which they themselves cannot afford to access. So there's that sort of thing, but there's also actually giving, not just having the ability to be able to access education, but also that education itself enabling you to actually use this technology. So, for instance, to be able to make videos, so you can stick them on YouTube, Vimeo, or any other platform, to be able to make websites. It's interesting. Again, I find it's interesting that, say, 20 years ago, the number of students who would know how to do things like, you know, make a website. Now they don't know how to do that. They're grown up with social media. If you show them the Wikipedia page, if you actually show them what the code is beneath the WYSIWYG interface, they're actually quite surprised because they've never actually seen the code behind a document. So those sorts of things I think are really important, that to give them people the skills to actually be able to use this technology, so they're not just reduced back to passive consumers. Because as I said, one of the great appeals of the internet was precisely this allowed us to get away from just being, you know, readers of newspapers, listeners to the radio, viewers of TV programs, but actually to be able to, you know, comment on them, to talk to people, to actually make our own media, community. I mean, that's where, you know, my origins being interested in this was actually making pirate radio and what the Italians call free radio, community radio. And then applying those principles to this new technology. And I think this, again, it was an integral part of the 2016 Digital Democracy Manifesto, and actually informed Labour's party policies about thinking about how we could make education more inclusive and actually empowering people to do stuff. Okay, so I suppose the hardware and stuff. So finally, I think, again, this comes out of this is actually about thinking beyond you know, this double, or sometimes if you're TH Marshall, 3 layers: civil rights, political rights, socio-economic, is to go forward and think about, well, actually, if we are going to create a new society, you know, we're moving to 5G, to AI, to big data, you know, facial recognition, all these other technologies to create what's often called the smart city, or shall we say, which often is this very dystopian view. Again, as I said, interesting, it's always projected onto Shenzhen and not in Silicon Valley, but I don't really, you know, Eric Schmidt, you know, is a great admirer of the Chinese high-tech vision of the future, and it doesn't surprise me because actually they're very similar, I think, in lots of ways. Collecting data, identifying people, and as I said, it's a very top-down approach. If you want to think of a bottom-up approach, we have to think about how do we create a different cybernetic and collaborative view of society. Particularly if you think, you know, Norbert Wiener, who is the founder of cybernetic, pointed out that particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, its appropriation by the military-industrial complex in America was that they saw it as top-down. But as he points out, you know, cybernetic is based on feedback loops. So it's the information going upwards is as important as well. So, okay, there's two really basic ones. Under the previous government in Brazil, they also adopted a sort of Bill of Rights. And because Gilberto Gil, who's Minister of Culture, was very much into open source software and hardware, they put this in. You know, one of the key things the hotspots is to try and have open source software, but also to extend that outwards, to think about, and again, it was interesting listening to the previous speaker about, you know, the way that the algorithms that are feeding us information are hidden. We don't know what's in them. You know, if you want to know, you know, one of the things lots of people say, you know, the Eli Paris, the stuff on filter bubbles, is that one of the things the algorithms are doing are creating you in a little site. You know, you just keep being fed what you want, and it encourages people to go further down the rabbit hole into craziness because they're in an echo chamber where they're only talking to other people who are equally crazy. I mean, in Britain we have this where you try to talk about lots of people who are in favour of Brexit, and you try to talk to them about the reality of what trying to leave the EU might actually mean. They refuse to listen to you because they're listening to other people who are in the same fantasy land as they are. I think they're going to get a big shock in a month or so's time, but anyway. So having open technology is a way of actually countering that. It's actually to so that we can have it's really also doing at the very basis the internet. Because if you think what the internet was doing right from the beginning was connecting different types of software together. You know, the World Wide Web, its great success, you know, and it was originally designed, wasn't it, by Tim Berners-Lee, to allow computers running different types of word processor or database, you know, to actually interconnect with each other. That's what it is. It's an open standard that connecting proprietary systems together, and so it's to apply that to everything. So to open up government databases, to open up commercial databases, and to allow people to use them. And again, as I said, this comes from, you know, the Declaration of Internet Freedom. Again, comes from, you know, it can be seen in a sort of liberal, even neoliberal sense, as encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship. It can also be seen in a democratic sense, that it allowed people collectively to hold those with private and public power to account. And so, as I said, the freedom to innovate and create with it. You know, my experience living in London for the last 40 or so years is the most creative people in the society are those people outside of the establishment. They are the ones who are innovating because they're the ones who are forced to in a way. They're the ones, certainly, you know, we have a very vibrant music culture in the capital here. And it's always, you know, it's always been often those people who are not established, and often the amateurs who are doing the cutting edge stuff. And so I think we need to actually create a space where the system doesn't exclude people. And it's interesting, again, it's one of these shifts. It's interesting, the shift from, say, a web-based internet to one based on the mobile phone has been actually to close a lot of this off. You know, we developed for the 2017 British general election, we developed an app called Corbyn Run, which was incredibly successful. We got well over 1 million views, but it had to be pre-approved by both Android and Apple before we could release it. In fact, it became a difficulty in the 2019 election to do an update, precisely because of the very slow approval process. And if you have a very quick general election, you know, this becomes a difficulty. So I think we need to think about this, about the way that and this goes back to the whole purpose of the Digital Democracy Manifesto, is to empower people within this new forms of technology, politics and culture. You know, why would you need a separate Bill of Rights for these technologies? Why can't you just apply the old ones? You know, 1689 English Bill of Rights, you know, 1791 US Bill of Rights, 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and so on. Well, it's because precisely that it's forcing us towards these much more collaborative and cybernetic concepts. It's not just the lone individual, it's large groups of people having to interact. And which really comes to the end. As I said, this is the one on the right is Jeremy speaking to a crowd in London during this campaign. As you can see, he was very popular. It is, as I said, one of his great heroes is Salvador Allende. And during the early 70s, obviously before the CIA overthrew the Popular Unity government for having the temerity, was it Henry Kissinger said that he wouldn't allow the Chileans to go communist even if they voted for it. I dispute whether, I think what he meant by communism and what the Chileans meant were rather different. But as he said, the comrade president, companero president, says the government is the people. I think this, again, is a really important concept. The wishes of the people should be made known to the government at all times. We will use technology to which the people do it. So Stafford Beer was a cybernetician. He was a management consultant. He was employed by the Popular Unity government to set up really a proto-planning system, democratic planning system called CyberSyn. And it was very successful as a prototype. A lot of people now see it as a potential model for, moving away from, obviously the Chinese have very successful 5-year plans, as we can see by their great advances in technology over the last 20 years. But it's a centrally decided system. The government bureaucracy, the enlightened mandarins, they've had 2,000 years of practice of this. Essentially decide what's happening. As someone interested in cybernetics, Stafford Beer wanted to actually use bottom-up feedback. So he had this idea, what he called the viable system model, of actually having layers of decision making, so that you could, the problem is, in any democracy, it's a signal noise problem. If you have everybody speaking, there's too much noise and you can't make decisions, and so you're forced to attenuate the variety. I've almost finished the last slide. I'm almost finished. Yeah, is to attenuate variety, and one of the ways you do this is through representative democracy, elect people. The other is to do it through other systems as well. And he wanted to use computer networks to do this. And I think this is the sort of underlying vision behind something like the Digital Democracy Manifesto, is that by empowering people with these rights, civil rights, political rights, socio-economic rights, and then eventually cybernetic and collaborative rights, is to allow them to participate. So the democracy is not just a set of professional politicians who often basically look out for their own interests. Yeah, it's also the people. So as Salvador Allende says, the government is the people. And to make that possible, so one of the visions we could use for these technologies, by giving people rights of 21st century rights, is to allow them to run the government, but also importantly to run the economy. And I think that is the key to thinking about how do we create, democratic planning? How do we make corporations accountable? And how do we create governments that actually are the people, rather than tell the people what to do and think? Thank you.